2 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 7, this is what the Word of God has to say. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted because I preach God's gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. For I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. And why? Because I do not love you? God knows I do. And what am I doing? And what I am doing, I will continue to do in order to undermine the claim of those who would like to claim that in their boasted mission they work on the same terms as we do. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. When new parents welcome home their newborn babies into their homes, they do so with all kinds of hopes and dreams for their children. And that's true of not only the parents, but the grandparents and friends and family. When you're around a newborn baby, there's all kinds of anticipation and hope and dream about what that child will grow up to become and what they will do. For the parents, more fundamental than the careers their children will pursue or the sports their children may enjoy, parents are ultimately, fundamentally most interested in transferring their values, their worldview, their understanding of truth to their children. They're hoping that their children will grow up to understand and believe the things that they believe to be true. Now, if you are a parent this morning, then you will understand this next sentence. Parenting is a humbling experience. For all the dreams of when our children are babies, when they begin to have their own voice and their own will, it humbles you as a parent. Most parents start with full assurance and confidence in their ability. Oh, their kids are going to turn out great because they're great parents. However, by the time children reach their teenage years, parents speak a whole lot less about their philosophy of child rearing and a whole lot more about the grace of God that covers a multitude of sin. One of the most heartbreaking experiences of parenting is when children who have been raised in a godly home and have been taught the truth of God are lured away by the deceptions of the world and reject the truths that their parents raised them in. Been pastoring now a little over 20 years. And over the course of those 2 decades, I have had many, many tear-filled conversations with parents as we prayed and wept over our children. No matter how far a child has wandered or how great a child has rebelled, godly parents do not give up hope that God will draw them back to Himself. No matter how long it's been, godly parents continue to call on the Lord to rescue their child and take every opportunity they have to speak to their children the truth of the gospel in hopes that God will use that to draw them back to Himself. I think that heartbreaking intensity of what parents feel for their children when their children are in danger of being lured away from the truth is the right way to understand this passage and the way that Paul is writing to the church. I don't think there's any doubt that Paul loved the Corinthians and the Corinthian church. He considered them his own children in the faith. He was the one who had gone and preached the gospel. He was the one who had personally led many of them to Jesus. He felt a kinship with them, a relationship to them, a connection with them in the faith. And he considered them his children in the faith. And I think he is heartbroken that they may be led astray by wicked men preaching a gospel not faithful to the true gospel. And so in this passage, he contends for them by preaching the truth in love. And as I preach this passage today, I'm going to be using the word preach. In fact, all 3 points today begin with the word preach. But I want you to hear me carefully. I don't mean it today in the formal sense of a preacher preaching. Now, certainly it would be an appropriate application to that. That's correct and right, but I'm using it today in a more broader sense, in more common sense of proclaiming the truth. Every parent preaches to their children. In the community, we preach to our community in the sense that we are proclaiming the gospel to our community, taking the opportunity to speak truth to one another. That's the sense that I'm using the word preach today. All of us are called to proclaim the word of God. And regardless of what is happening in the church, in fact, even in opposition to those who are speaking false in the church, Paul is preaching to them. He is speaking the words to them that in the hope they might be led to the righteousness of God. And so here's how I want to divide the passage today as we consider it. Number one, thinking about how we proclaim the gospel to the world around us, we must preach without burden. In other words, we preach free of charge to the world around us. Number two, we preach as compelled by love. Because we love our brothers and sisters, because we love our families and our extended families, because we love our neighbors, because we love the world around us, we must proclaim the gospel to them that they may be saved from the wrath of God. And then lastly, quite honestly, we preach the truth of God in order to oppose, to thwart Satan's lies that lead to destruction. Let's begin with preaching without burden. I see this in the opening verses that we read this morning, where Paul writes about how he had related to the church when he first came to preach to them. He says, I preach God's gospel to you free of charge. In fact, I don't think he means this in the negative. I think he means this almost hyperbolically. I robbed other churches. No, he didn't take money unknowingly. They gave it to him. But he's saying, other churches gave of their resources that I might come to you to preach the gospel to you. They bore the financial burden that you could hear the gospel free of charge. So to that end, I would say to you, friends, we must preach. We must proclaim the gospel without burden to those who hear it. In other words, we preach without personal demands. Now, judging from Paul's words in verses 7 and 9, I think it's safe to assume two possibilities. In fact, I think probably both of these are true. The first is that there probably were some in the church making accusations against him that his preaching amongst the Corinthians was for personal gain. And it's probably rightly to assume here that the false teachers were, in fact, preaching for personal gain. Now, the reason why I say it's likely that both these are probably true is because a common trait of those who are working to deceive is to accuse others of the very thing that they're doing. In fact, one of the oldest accusations to make against a gospel preacher is to say, well, you're just doing that to get money and make yourself rich. And so Paul is having to deal with this on two accounts. Number one, he's trying to oppose those who are probably using the gospel to enrich themselves, and he's having to defend against the accusation against himself that that's why he came and preached the gospel in the first place. And so Paul describes his preaching amongst the Corinthians with these words. He says in verse 7, it was humbling. He says, or did I commit sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted? He talks about that he preached free of charge to the Corinthians. In other words, he demanded nothing from them in receiving of the gospel. And it says that he talks about that it caused him to endure personal cost. In verse 9, he talks about that he was in need when he was preaching to the Corinthians, but he didn't receive any reimbursement or help from the Corinthians. So his needs that were incurred by going and preaching the gospel to them, the Corinthian church had no part in relieving. And Paul understood that demanding support from the church, which I think would be right and proper for him to do, would give his accusers the opportunity to discredit his work. And so, he demanded nothing from the Corinthian church. Friends, as you take the gospel to neighbors, whether that means across the street neighbors or around the world neighbors, go without any expectations from those to whom you preach. We must faithfully be proclaimers of the gospel and preach Jesus, not for personal gain, not in order to place new burdens on those who believe. Now, it is right and good to offer the gospel free of charge to all those who would hear it. It is right and good to offer the gospel without any special burdens. Listen to me carefully. If you're here today, you're not a member of Central Baptist, you're here today because you want to hear the gospel preached, there is no expectation upon you to pay anything to hear that. This building, this campus, the opportunity to preach this morning, and for that matter, if you're hearing it live, if you're watching it online, if you hear it 10 years from now in one of the archives, it's provided to you free of charge because the gospel is preached without any burden to those who are hearing it. So we preach without burden, but there's a second dynamic here. We preach without burden to those who are hearing, but for the church, we must understand that the church sends out those who preach the gospel with full support. So look back in your text to verses 8 and 9. In verse 8, he says, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So his point there is, you received it free, but it wasn't free because somebody else paid for it. Now, that's true of everything in life. If you get to eat, if you have a free lunch tomorrow at noon, it's free to you, but somebody else paid for that lunch. And this is the dynamic here that Paul is getting at. We preach freely to those who have yet to hear the gospel, but from the church's point of view, we must own and accept the reality and the responsibility to send with full support. Preaching the gospel free of charge sounds good, doesn't it? Preaching the gospel free of charge sounds like a utopian idea. However, this side of heaven, there is a cost to everything we do. If you want to go across the street, and if you want to go further, if you want to go around the world, there is a cost to going and preaching. In these verses, the Bible is not ignoring the reality of economics, and the Bible is not calling the church to ignore the logistics of ministry. Every now and then you'll get around somebody and they'll have a big dream of ministry. And their big dream of ministry will have big cost associated with it. And so they'll just say, well, let's just go after it and just hope that the support comes with it. Now, sometimes that may be appropriate, but more often than not, the church has to figure out, here's the big dream of ministry, how can we sacrifice, how can we support that big dream of ministry? These verses are not a rejection of the logistical reality of ministry and missions, but rather I think they are instructive for how the church funds these endeavors. we are able to preach free of charge the gospel because of the faithfulness of the church to fund these endeavors. Notice that Paul indicated that his needs were not met or expected to be met by the Corinthians when he preached to them. That's the free of charge dynamic. But in verse 9, Paul indicated that when he was preaching to the Corinthians, his needs were being met by the Christians from Macedonia. It was free to the Corinthians, but it was being paid for by the Macedonians. We practice this principle locally when we invite friends and neighbors to hear the gospel preached here. When you invite a neighbor to come to this campus, you never say, now, to get in the door, you have to pay an entry fee. There's no such thing. No, you invite a neighbor and you say, come to church, won't cost you anything. And I hope when you invite your neighbors to church, you say, and I'll even take you out to lunch afterwards. There are no expectations are placed on them to pay any fee or to give any money. In fact, the campus facilities are provided free of charge to all who walk in here. I've been able to labor this week to prepare to preach you this message because this church has provided for me financially that I can preach free of charge on Sunday. Praise God for that. We practice this principle globally. When we give to support international missionaries and North American missionaries, this morning when we took up our offering, a portion of every dollar that you gave this morning, we're going to send as a church to the cooperative program. The cooperative program is a collection of offerings from every Southern Baptist church, and those offerings are collected that we might send right now somewhere around 5,000 missionaries globally to take the gospel free of charge wherever God takes them. Now, they're able to do that because their grocery money and their transportation budgets and their retirement funds are paid for by you and by me and by other Southern Baptists, so that those that they go preach to don't pay a dime for their work. They go to preach free of charge because they are fully supported by the churches who've already heard the gospel of Jesus. Friends, you heard the gospel because of the faithfulness of other saints who provided for the needs of the one who made the gospel and who preached the gospel to you. And in response to this grace, provide for the needs of others going to make Jesus known. It changes how you give, doesn't it? If you understand this principle that we preach free of charge because of the support of the saints, give with a joyful heart, friends, when you give to missions, that the gospel is going to be preached free around the globe. Give with a joyful heart when you give to the support of the local ministry here, that free of charge, the gospel from this pulpit and in other ministries of the church can be proclaimed free of charge. We preach without burden. And secondly, we preach as compelled by love. Look in verse 10. So Paul says in verse 10, as the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be silenced in the regions of Achaia. And why? Because I do not love you? God knows I do. A couple of things here. Number one, I think Paul is making the case that truth demands to be proclaimed. We preach the gospel, we proclaim the truth of God first and foremost, for the glory of God. It must have been, and I think you can imagine this with me, it must have been a personal heartache to Paul that these saints who had been won for the Lord were now being tempted and possibly led astray from the true gospel. And yet in verse 10, Paul declares that he will not be silenced. Now, this reference, this Achaia, this is the general area where Corinth is. And so he's saying, listen, I'm going to keep preaching. I'm going to keep making the gospel known. Regardless of what happens here at the church, I am going to make Jesus known in this area. Now, the point is both, I think, bold and sad at the same time. Bold in that no matter what happens, Paul will continue to be obedient to God's call to preach the saving grace of God. And that's kind of where we have to be, friends. If the whole world turns away from Jesus, you be faithful to proclaim him wherever you are. If your whole family rejects the gospel, you be faithful to preach Jesus in your family no matter what. If everybody you know turns their back on the Lord, you be faithful to preach Jesus. In other words, I will not be silent wherever I am for the glory of God. That's the boldness I think Paul is speaking here. But second, I think there's a sadness in this as well, in that there is a recognition of the possibility that the Corinthians may not join him in continuing the work of proclaiming the true gospel. I do not think we should read the words, "This boasting of mine will not be silenced," in verse 10, in a defiant or arrogant tone. I believe the better way to understand this declaration is in the determination of truth. Maybe even say, rather than saying, "I will not be silent," I cannot be silent. Friends, man is made in God's image. And part of being image bearers of God is a desire both to know the truth and to proclaim the truth. The greater the consequence of truth, the more compelled we become to make it known. If you know something, if you know a truth that is determinative upon someone's life, safety, well-being, there's something deep within you that compels you to make that known. Friends, the only hope of salvation is in Jesus and his cross. No heartache can take away the desire to make that known. No disappointment can take away the desire to make that known. Even the rejection of some who once believed cannot take away the desire to make that known. Oh, there's a heartbreak indeed that these who Paul had led to the Lord may turn away from the true gospel. But he's just saying, listen, I am compelled to make that truth known no matter what happens. The joys and sorrows of personal relationships cannot deter you from making known the hope of the gospel. Many of you have children, grandchildren, spouses, close friends who have turned away from the gospel of Jesus. They have listened to a false gospel, believed it, and have been lured away, and you're brokenhearted. But brothers and sisters, if you believe the gospel to be true, that the only hope of salvation is in Jesus, you cannot be silent. You are compelled by love. You are compelled by truth. Love demands it of us. Truth demands to be proclaimed, and love demands that we proclaim the truth. The determination of verse 10 is for the glory of God. God's truth must be made known for his glory's sake. In verse 11, Paul makes clear his determination to continue to preach, his determination to continue to preach is not for his lack of love for the Corinthians, but because of his love for them. In fact, he says, God knows my heart and knows that he does indeed love the Corinthians. So there's probably a safe assumption here that some are saying Paul doesn't love you, didn't care about you to begin with. Remember, in the beginning of this book, there was some accusations about Paul lying about coming back to them, and so possibly that's connected to this. And Paul just has to appeal to the reality of that God's judgment is sure. God knows my heart, that I love you indeed. And I think this points to the second reason why we preach the gospel. Verse 10, for the glory of God, because the truth must be proclaimed. Verse 11, for the salvation of men motivated by love. The Bible is very clear about what motivated God to provide salvation for the world. You probably can quote John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. This same love motivates the church to take the gospel to the lost world. True love demands that truth be proclaimed. As a father and as a pastor, I have had many difficult conversations where uncomfortable things and hard things needed to be said. Now, total honesty, I have never looked forward to these conversations. I've never enjoyed these conversations. I often dread them right up to the moment that they happen. Sometimes I even feel sick in anticipation and thinking about these conversations and what needs to be said. With all this difficulty and unpleasantness, you may wonder why I would even have these conversations. It would have been easier, more pleasurable, just to maybe turn a blind eye to known sin, or just pretend like things weren't amiss or dysfunctional, or just trying to just kind of barrel through it and hope things get better. Why not just try to move past the problems and maybe ignore them, and maybe they'll get better? But friends, I initiated every one of these unpleasant moments not because they bring pleasure, but because they might bring healing. And even though they made me sick to think about them, and even though they were unpleasant, and even though I didn't desire them, long for them, enjoy them, I had those conversations because the one I was having them with, I loved enough to speak those words to them. Because I love my children, I'm unwilling to turn a blind eye to what will bring destruction into their lives. Because I love the saints of Central Baptist Church, I am unwilling to look past things that I know will bring you to destruction. True love demands you speak truth to one another. We preach without burden. We preach as compelled by love. And then thirdly, I think we see out of this passage that we preach to oppose Satan's lies. In verse 12, Paul says, "And what I am doing, I will continue to do." In other words, I'm not going to quit, brothers. What I'm doing, I'm going to continue to do in order, notice this phrase, in order to undermine, cut. That's what some of your translations may say. To undermine the claim of those who would like to claim that in their boasted mission they work on the same terms as we do. These men are false apostles, deceitful workmen. Friends, we preach to oppose Satan's lies. That means that we work to expose false teachers. False teachers preach and teach things that when you first hear them sound good, seem right, and appear to be faithful to the true gospel. Any gospel other than the true gospel and the faithful gospel of Jesus cannot and will not save. Now, I said in last week's sermon, lies always lead to or end with disappointment. Because lies tell you that something has value or worth or is sure, but at some point, every lie is exposed and it's revealed not to be faithful to what it promised. False teachers may sound good, but they are not good. And because what they preach is a lie, it can only lead toward destruction, never toward salvation. Verse 12 uses a figurative language that the ESV translates as to undermine. The word literally means to cut off, to cause to cease by removing. Kind of like cutting off a flower, or as Barney Fife would say, nip it in the bud. So this is what the New American Standard 95, NIV 84, King James are trying to capture. So New American Standard says, may cut off opportunity of those. NIV says in order to cut the ground from under. King James says that I may cut off occasion for them. All of these are trying to capture the meaning. And the point that Paul is making is that it is his intention to act toward these false teachers in such a way as to actively oppose and to expose their lies, to remove them from the church, to undermine them, to cut off, to do away with, to remove the footing from under them, to destroy them. That's hard language. That's fighting words, as my granddad would say. Shepherds must do more than guard the sheep. Sometimes shepherds must fight the wolves. It's not enough to know the truth, yet refuse to actively oppose and expose and fight against lies. The saints of God love the truth of God and must hate anything that takes away from His truth. That's the first duty when contending against false teachers, is to warn others of their lies. There's a false sense of safety, friends, if we think we can just gather and sing our songs of worship and hear the word preached and not recognize that there is always a threat of those who would speak things that are not true within the church. And in today's world of media access, that threat has just exponentially increased. In the days when the church primarily and maybe exclusively heard only the preaching from their own pulpit, it was a matter of guarding the pulpit so that what was preached from the pulpit was faithful and true. But friends, the truth is, even before you came here today, many of you were exposed to other preachers from pulpits as far away as on the other side of this nation. And then you add into that the media influence. And so, listen, total honesty here, some of you have given ear to the false teachers like Joel Osteen. You read his books, you listen to his preaching. Friends, those are false teachers. You cannot listen to a lie and believe that your heart will not be influenced. As a church, as a pastor, as Sunday school teachers, as brothers and sisters who know the truth, we must first work to expose, to oppose, to work against false teachers within the church. And then secondly, we must work to rescue the deceived. Verse 14 and 15. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will correspond to their deeds. Rescue the deceived. As a kid growing up, the cartoons that I watched, those cartoons always depicted the devil as a red little monster, horns, a long pointy tail, an evil laugh, and a lot of times carried a pitchfork. Now, if Satan really looked like that, we would all pretty easily identify that and be able to quickly and effectively run away and stay away from Satan. But Paul says, Satan himself, look at what he says, look it back in the text. He says, Satan himself disguises himself as an angel of light. He looks appealing. He looks right. And he's saying, listen, if Satan does that, surely his false apostles, surely his deceivers, surely even other spirits and those who proclaim a false gospel do the same thing. They clothe themselves in order to look right even while they are destructive. It's the old phrase that we might say, wolves in sheep's clothing. Satan and his servants disguise themselves as messengers of truth and righteousness, and by this, but this is just a disguise. They are in fact demons of darkness and servants of wickedness. And they are leading all they can away from the true gospel and toward destruction. The most dangerous place a person can be is under the influence of a deceiver. They believe they are being led well, but in truth, they are being led toward destruction. It's not always possible to rescue someone from being deceived. However, friends, I think love demands. When you recognize that someone is being deceived, you do all you can to break the deceiver's hold and deliver them to the truth. Over 20 plus years of pastoral ministry, I've had more conversations where I've gone to someone who I have believed is being deceived, and they have chosen to remain in that deception, and that's heartbreaking. But I want to tell you, those are glorious moments when you go, and by God's grace, shining the light of truth into that situation breaks the hold of the deceiver and rescues. Friends, we preach to oppose Satan's lies, and we do that by, one, exposing false teachers and their lies, and then loving our brothers and sisters enough to rescue them from being deceived. You may have heard this story. I'm sure I've shared it with you before, about a man named Harry Truman, not the president. This man was named Harry Randall Truman. He was last seen alive at his home at about 6 p.m. on May 17th, 1980. Since then, he's never been seen, and he will never be seen again. At the time, he was 83 years old, and he had lived in his home for just about 40 years. And he had chosen to remain in his home despite multiple pleas for him to move to safety. Harry Randall Truman had received letters from school children from all across the nation begging him to change his mind. Scientists with PhDs and other advanced degrees had personally gone to his home and asked him to move to safety. Government officials, law enforcement, first responders had all been by his home and made personal pleas along with other communication with him to move him away from danger. And because of his encalcitrance and because of his tenacity to stay in his home, he had become a curiosity to many of the news media. But even when they would go and interview him, most of them would end after the interview with a personal plea. Why don't you come with us to safety? He gave his last interview at about 6 p.m. on May 17th, 1980. That was the last time anybody ever saw him. Harry Randall Truman had owned and operated a lodge at the base of Mount St. Helens on Spirit Lake since the 1920s. In 1980, when the mountain began to show volcanic activity, he was told and advised that he should leave because everyone believed that all the activity, the seismic activity, the smoke, and other things like that coming from the mountain meant that Mount St. Helens was soon to erupt. Harry Randall Truman believed that the volcano had already released all of its energy that it was really going to release, and if it indeed erupted, that the magma flow would flow down the other side of the mountain, and that his lodge and lake and property would really not be all that affected. He was last seen on May 17th at 6 p.m. The next day, on May 18th, at 8:32 a.m., a magnitude 5.1 earthquake centered directly under the north slope triggered a part of the volcano to slide. And following that, a few seconds later, the main volcano blasted forth an eruption. The landslide that followed was the largest landslide in recorded human history. It traveled at 110 to 155 miles per hour, moved across Spirit Lake's west arm. Some of the slides spilled over the ridge, but most moved 13 miles down the North Fork River, filling its valley up to 600 feet with avalanche debris. An area of about 24 square miles was covered. Truman and his lodge were buried under 150 feet of volcanic landslide. Harry Randall Truman chose to ignore the warnings and pleas for his safety. He rejected anyone that contradicted his assessment of his own safety, and he looked up at the smoking volcano and arrogantly proclaimed it to be benign, and ultimately his arrogance cost him his life. Now, if you go home today and you're interested in his story and you Google his name, you will find news reports and writing about him. And most of the time when Harry Randall Truman is talked about and his story is told, the emphasis is placed on Truman's tenacity to remain in harm's way. Songs have been written, poems have been done, documentaries, and even a movie has been made about him, all sort of making him out as a hero because of his tenacity and belief in his home, in his lake, in his lodge, and where he had spent the majority of his life. But I think what is more remarkable about the story is the multitude of people who attempted to warn him of the coming danger. School children from across the nation, when they saw the newsreels of him, began to write letters to him. Every scientist that was up and down on the mountain making seismic recordings begged him. Law enforcement and government officials and all the rest, everyone who interacted with Truman ended their conversation with a plea, please leave the mountain. Didn't matter if it was 10 or 100 people had already done so before. Everyone felt compelled to plead with Harry Truman to escape his impending danger. Now, you can easily understand this, I think. If you knew someone was living in the shadow of a massive volcano that was about to erupt, whether you knew them personally or you had just heard about them, there's something deep within you that instinctively just wants to beg them, get out of the way of the lava flow. You're literally in the shadow of a volcano that's about to erupt. Escape for your very life. You would not, in fact, I think better said, you could not be silent in your warnings to them. Friends, I think likewise in our present day, when we think about preaching the gospel to our friends and our neighbors and those around us, we must not remain silent. As long as people are in danger of the wrath of God and the consequence of hell, we cannot be silent. We're not building church organizations for the sake of organization's sakes. We are preaching the gospel for the salvation of eternity's sake. We cannot be silent. Salvation and the forgiveness of sins is found only in Jesus and nothing else. The judgment of God is coming. The wrath of God will be poured out on this earth. God's wrath is greater than any volcano ever can be or will be. Preach these truths with every breath that you have until your last breath. Do not be silent for the glory of God and for the love of those around you.
Thank you for listening to All for the Kingdom, a weekly podcast of my preaching ministry. For more sermons, blog posts, and other related content, go to bensmithsenior.org. That's bensmithsr.org. I am the pastor of Central Baptist Church in Waycross, Georgia. I would love for you to join us this coming Sunday at 201 Ava Street here in Waycross. Our morning services begin at 10:30 a.m. For more information about Central Baptist, go to cbcwaycross.org. Again, thank you for listening, and until the Lord returns, let us live each moment all for the King and all for the kingdom.